The entire restaurant fell silent when the mafia boss walked in and saw the woman waiting for him by the window. The men who had set up the date were already watching from across the room, barely hiding their laughter. They had told him it was a blind date. What they hadn't told him was that the woman couldn't hear a single word he would say. To them, it was the perfect joke. A powerful man, a deaf woman, an awkward disaster waiting to happen, but the moment she nervously raised her hands and signed her name, the mafia boss slowly lifted his own hands and answered in flawless sign language. The smiles across the room disappeared, because what no one knew was why he had learned that language in the first place, and the reason would break your heart. The entire restaurant fell silent when Trevor Turner walked through the glass double doors of Bellini's on a Friday evening in late October. It wasn't the kind of silence born from fear, though fear was certainly part of it. It was the kind of silence that moves through a room the way a cold draft slips under a door. Subtle, instinctive, everyone felt it. The couple at table 9 stopped mid-conversation. The bartender paused with a bottle of Barolo tilted over a glass. Even the hostess, a woman who had greeted senators and Wall Street tycoons without flinching, took a half-step backward. Trevor Turner didn't acknowledge any of it. He moved through the dining room in a dark navy suit, no tie, his collar open just enough to reveal the edge of a tattoo that climbed up the left side of his neck. His jaw was set. His eyes swept the room the way a general surveys a battlefield, not because he expected danger, but because he had long ago trained himself to see everything before everything saw him. At 32, Trevor Turner controlled more of Philadelphia's underworld than most people even knew existed. He didn't run drugs. He didn't rob banks. He moved power. He moved money. He moved silence. And when silence wasn't enough, he moved people out of the way. But tonight wasn't about business. Tonight, according to his associate Vincent Mara, was about something else entirely, a blind date. Trevor hadn't wanted to come. He didn't date. He didn't do small talk. He didn't sit across from strangers and pretend to care about their favorite vacation destinations or their opinions on craft cocktails. But Vincent had insisted, said the woman was beautiful, said she was different, said it would be good for him to spend one evening pretending to be a normal man. What Vincent hadn't told him was the truth. Across the restaurant, tucked into a curved leather booth near the window, a woman sat alone. She wore a soft cream blouse and her dark auburn hair fell just past her shoulders. Her hands rested on the white tablecloth, and she was watching the candlelight flicker inside its glass holder with the kind of quiet attention that most people reserved for sunsets or sleeping children. Her name was Sue Hodges. She was 26 years old. She was a teacher at the Whitmore School for the Deaf on the west side of the city. She loved watercolor painting, long walks through Rittenhouse Square, and the way autumn turned the trees along the Schuylkill River into walls of gold and amber, and she hadn't heard a single sound since she was 3 years old. At a table near the bar, Vincent Mara sat with 2 other men, Paulie Greco and Sal DeLuca. All 3 of them had drinks in their hands and smirks plastered across their faces like boys waiting for a firecracker to go off. This was the joke. They had found Sue through a dating app, matched with her using a fake profile, told her she'd be meeting a successful businessman who admired her work with children. And then they had told Trevor the same thing in reverse: a beautiful woman, a quiet dinner, an evening away from the noise. What none of them had mentioned to Trevor was that the woman sitting in that booth could not hear a single word he would say. They had imagined the scene 100 times already. Trevor sitting down. The awkward silence. The confusion. Trevor trying to talk to a woman who would only stare at him, unable to respond. The discomfort. The frustration. The humiliation of a man who controlled entire neighborhoods, being rendered speechless by a woman who lived in a world without sound. To them, it was the perfect prank. A powerful man. A deaf woman. An awkward disaster waiting to happen. Trevor reached the booth. He looked down at her. She looked up at him, Her eyes were a deep hazel, warm and steady, and they held his gaze without flinching. There was no nervousness in them, not yet, but there was something careful, something watchful, as though she had learned, over years of navigating a hearing world, to read a person's entire character in the first 3 seconds of eye contact. She smiled gently and raised her hands. Her fingers moved with a quiet grace, each gesture precise and unhurried. "Hi, I'm Sue. Thank you for meeting me." The 3 men at the bar leaned forward. This was it. This was the moment the whole thing fell apart. But something happened that none of them expected. Trevor Turner stood perfectly still for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he lifted his hands. His fingers moved with a fluency that startled even the waiter who had approached to offer water. "It's nice to meet you, Sue. I'm Trevor. Mind if I sit down?" His sign language was flawless. Not hesitant, not clumsy. Not the kind of fumbling approximation a person makes when they've watched a few YouTube tutorials. His hands moved with the muscle memory of someone who had been signing for years. Decades, even. Sue's eyes widened. Her lips parted slightly, and then she smiled. Not the polite smile she had offered before, but something deeper, something surprised and genuine and relieved. At the bar, Vincent Mara's glass froze halfway to his lips. Paulie Greco blinked. Sal DeLuca leaned back in his chair and whispered a single word that none of them would repeat later. The joke was over before it had even begun, and something else, something none of them could have predicted, had already started. Trevor sat down across from her, and for a moment, neither of them signed anything. They just looked at each other. The candle light moved between them, casting soft shadows across the tablecloth, and the noise of the restaurant seemed to dim, as if the room itself understood that what was happening at this table required a different kind of attention. Sue tilted her head slightly. Her hands rose again. "You sign beautifully. Most hearing people don't." Trevor's jaw tightened just barely, a movement so small that only someone trained in reading faces would have noticed it. But Sue noticed. She noticed everything. "I had a good teacher," he signed back. He didn't elaborate. She didn't push. That was the first thing he noticed about her, the way she understood that silence could be a complete sentence. They ordered dinner through a combination of sign language and the waiter's admirable patience. Sue pointed to items on the menu and signed her preferences to Trevor, who relayed them aloud. It was seamless, natural, as though they had done this 100 times before, over bruschetta and a shared plate of burrata. Their conversation unfolded in the most extraordinary way. It was entirely silent. Their hands did all the talking, moving through the air between them, like birds tracing invisible paths, and anyone watching from a distance might have mistaken it for something choreographed. A dance, a duet performed by 2 people who had somehow rehearsed without ever meeting. "Tell me something about you that no one at this restaurant would guess," Sue signed. Trevor studied her face. Then his hands moved. "I haven't signed with anyone in 4 years." Sue's expression shifted, not pity. Something closer to recognition. "Why did you stop?" He didn't answer right away. His hand stayed on the table, and for a moment the only movement between them was the slow rise and fall of the candle flame. Then, carefully, as though the words themselves were made of glass, he signed, "I lost the person I used to sign with." Sue held his gaze. She didn't sign "I'm sorry," which was what most people would have done. Instead, she signed something that stopped him cold. "Then I'm glad your hands still remember." Trevor Turner had not felt a lump in his throat in years. He had buried men. He had stared down federal agents. He had received phone calls at 3 in the morning that would have broken lesser men and responded with nothing more than a quiet instruction and a steady hand. But, sitting across from this woman, watching her say something so simple and so profoundly kind, he felt something crack open in his chest that he had spent 4 years sealing shut. Her name had been Lily. Lily Turner. Waity, born 14 months after Trevor. Born into the same chaotic household, the same broken family, the same cramped apartment in South Philly, where the walls were thin and the shouting never stopped. But Lily never heard the shouting. She had been deaf since birth, profoundly, completely deaf. And in a household defined by noise, by arguments, by slamming doors and breaking glass, Lily existed in a world of perfect stillness. Trevor had learned sign language before he learned to read. It wasn't something anyone taught him. It was something he needed. Because Lily was his best friend. His only friend, for a long time. And if he wanted to talk to her, if he wanted to tell her about his day, or ask her what she dreamed about, or warn her that their father was in one of his moods, he had to learn her language. So he did. By the time he was 8, he was fluent. By the time he was 12, he was her interpreter at school meetings, doctor's appointments, parent-teacher conferences their parents never attended. He spoke for her in a world that had never bothered to listen. And Lily, in return, gave him the only peace he ever knew. When everything around them was falling apart, when the shouting got too loud and the walls felt too close, Trevor would sit on the fire escape with Lily, and they would sign to each other about nothing. About the pigeons on the roof across the street. About the clouds. About what they would do when they were older and free. She wanted to be an artist. She drew constantly, filling notebooks with sketches of faces and flowers and imaginary cities. Trevor would watch her draw and think that she was the only truly good thing in his life. And then, when he was 28 and she was 27, Lily died. A car accident. A rainy night on a 76. A driver who ran a red light. She never saw the headlights coming. She never heard the horn. She just stopped. Trevor received the call while sitting in the back of a black sedan after closing a deal that had taken him 3 months to negotiate. He listened to the voice on the other end. He ended the call. He put the phone in his pocket. And he never signed again, not a single word, or fiita, not a single gesture. He locked that part of himself away, the way a man boards up the windows of a house he can't bear to live in anymore, but refuses to sell. Until tonight, until Sue Hodges raised her hands in a candlelit restaurant and signed her name, and something inside Trevor Turner recognized her immediately, not as a stranger, not as a prank, but as a person who lived in the same silence that had once been his only refuge. The rest of the dinner passed in a kind of quiet magic that neither of them fully understood. They talked about everything and nothing. Sue told him about her students at Whitmore, the little ones who were just learning to sign, the way their faces lit up when they realized they could finally say what they felt. She told him about a boy named Marcus, who had been completely nonverbal for 2 years. Until one afternoon, during art class, he signed the word beautiful while looking at a painting Sue had hung on the wall. Trevor listened. He listened the way he hadn't listened to anyone in years, not for information, not for leverage, not for weakness, but simply because her words, her hands, the way her face moved when she signed, made him want to hear more. She told him about growing up deaf in a hearing family, about the loneliness of sitting at a dinner table surrounded by people whose mouths moved constantly, but whose words she could never catch. About learning to read lips, which was harder than most people imagined, and about the exhaustion of spending every waking moment trying to translate a world that wasn't designed for her. And he signed back, "I know." She looked at him, really looked at him. "You do, don't you?" She signed, "More than you'd believe." They left the restaurant just after 10 o'clock. The autumn air was cool and sharp, and the street lights along Walnut Street cast long amber pools across the sidewalk. Trevor held the door for her, and as she stepped past him, she looked up and signed, "Thank you for tonight." He signed back, "Thank you for reminding me." She tilted her head. "Reminding you of what?" He paused. His hands stayed at his sides for a moment, and then he signed, "That this language still lives inside me." They walked together for 3 blocks, without signing a word, just walking side by side. 2 people moving through the Philadelphia night with nothing between them but the sound of their footsteps and the kind of silence that didn't need to be filled. At the corner of 18th and Spruce, Sue stopped. She turned to face him. The streetlight above them hummed softly, casting a warm glow across her face. "I had a really wonderful time," she signed. "So did I." She smiled. Then she reached into her bag and pulled out a small card. She handed it to him. It had her name, her email, and the address of the Whitmore School. "If you ever want to talk again," she signed, "you know where to find me." He took the card. He held it carefully, the way a person holds something they know is fragile and important. And then she turned and walked toward the corner where a rideshare was already waiting. She climbed into the back seat, waved once through the window, and was gone. Trevor stood on the sidewalk for a long time after the car disappeared. He looked at the card in his hand. He thought about Lily. And for the first time in 4 years, the thought didn't come with the crushing weight of guilt and grief that usually accompanied it. It came instead with something lighter, something warmer, something that felt, if he was honest with himself, a little bit like permission. 3 days later, Trevor Turner walked through the front doors of the Whitmore School for the Deaf. He told no one where he was going. Not Vincent. Not Polly. Not Sal. Not a single person in his organization knew that the man who controlled half of Philadelphia's criminal infrastructure was standing in the lobby of a school for deaf children, wearing a gray sweater and holding a box of pastries from a bakery on Passyunk Avenue. Sue saw him from the end of the hallway. She froze for a half second, and then her face broke into the kind of smile that made everything around her seem a little less heavy. "You came," she signed. "You invited me," he signed back. She gave him a tour, the classrooms, the art studio, the playground. She introduced him to her students, a dozen children between the ages of 5 and 10, all of whom stared at him with the wide-eyed curiosity that only children possess. One girl, a tiny 6-year-old named Rosie with enormous brown eyes and 2 missing front teeth, tugged on Trevor's sleeve and signed, "Are you Sue's boyfriend?" Trevor looked down at her. He knelt so that he was at her eye level, and he signed, "I'm her friend." Rosie studied his face with the intensity of a Supreme Court justice evaluating testimony. Then she signed, "You have sad eyes." "But they're nice sad eyes." Trevor blinked. Sue covered her mouth to hide her laugh. And something inside Trevor Turner, something ancient and armored and heavy, shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. He came back the next week, and the week after that. Each time he arrived without announcement. Each time he brought something, pastries, art supplies, new books for the school library. He never made a production of it. He never asked for thanks. He simply showed up, sat in Sue's classroom, and signed with the children as though it were the most natural thing in the world. The children adored him. They climbed on him. They showed him their drawings. They taught him new signs that he pretended not to know, just to see their faces light up with the pride of being someone's teacher. And each time, after the children went home and the hallways grew quiet, Trevor and Sue would sit together in her classroom and sign about things that neither of them spoke about with anyone else. She told him about the night she realized she was different. She was 7. Her family was watching a movie together in the living room, and everyone was laughing at something on the screen, and she had no idea what was funny. She sat there, surrounded by her own family, and felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. He told her about Lily's drawings, about the fire escape, about the pigeons. He told her about the night Lily died, and about how he had driven to the hospital and sat in the parking lot for 45 minutes before he could make himself go inside, because some part of him believed that as long as he stayed in the car, as long as he didn't walk through those doors, it wouldn't be real. Sue's eyes were wet when he finished. She didn't wipe them. She just signed. She sounds like someone the world didn't deserve to lose. She was, Trevor signed. She really was. There was a Tuesday afternoon in early November that changed everything. Trevor arrived at the school to find the classroom in chaos. Not the usual happy chaos of children playing and signing, a different kind. Marcus, the boy Sue had told him about, the one who had been nonverbal for 2 years, was sitting in the corner of the room with his knees pulled to his chest and his face buried in his arms. He was shaking. Sue was kneeling in front of him, signing gently. But Marcus wasn't looking up. He wouldn't look at anyone. Trevor crossed the room and knelt beside Sue. She glanced at him, And in that glance he saw something he recognized. Helplessness, the kind that comes from loving someone and not being able to reach them. What happened? He signed. Some older boys, she signed. They were mocking his signing during recess. Called him broken. Trevor's expression didn't change, but his hands, resting on his knees, tightened into fists. He looked at Marcus. He looked at this small boy, curled into himself, like a question mark, trying to make himself invisible, trying to disappear from a world that had just told him he didn't belong. And Trevor saw himself. He saw the 8-year-old boy on the fire escape, learning a language that no one around him understood, protecting a sister that no one around him cared about. He reached out and gently touched Marcus on the shoulder. Marcus flinched. Then, slowly, he raised his head. His face was streaked with tears, and his eyes were red and swollen. Trevor signed very slowly, very clearly, so that Marcus could see every word. You are not broken. The people who said that are the broken ones. You speak a language that most people will never be brave enough to learn. That doesn't make you less. That makes you extraordinary. Marcus stared at him. Then, with trembling hands, the boy signed one word. Really? Trevor nodded. Really? Marcus looked at him for a long moment. Then, he uncurled from his corner, leaned forward, and wrapped his small arms around Trevor's neck. Trevor closed his eyes. He held the boy. And across the room, Sue Hodges watched the most feared man in Philadelphia kneel on a classroom floor and hold a crying child. And she understood something that no one else in Trevor's life would ever know, that the man the world saw, the cold, calculating, untouchable mafia boss, was a mask, a fortress, a wall built by a boy who had lost the only person who ever understood his silence. And that boy was still in there, still reaching out, still trying to protect someone. It was a Thursday evening in late November when Trevor took Sue to the fire escape, not the original one. That building had been torn down years ago, but there was a rooftop on a building he owned in South Philly, with a view of the city skyline and a wrought iron railing that looked close enough to the old fire escape that it made his chest ache. He brought 2 cups of coffee. He brought a blanket because the wind was sharp. They sat together on the edge of the rooftop and looked out at the city, and for a long time neither of them signed anything. Then Sue signed. You're different than people think you are. Trevor looked at her. Maybe. Or maybe I'm exactly what people think I am. And this is just the part they never get to see. She studied his face the way she always did, with that quiet, unblinking attention that made him feel like every wall he had ever built was made of paper. Which part is more real? She asked. He thought about that. He thought about Lily, about Marcus, about the children at Whitmore, about the men who worked for him, about the deals and the debts and the darkness that paid for everything. I don't know anymore, he signed honestly, but when I'm with you, I remember who I was before all of it. And that version of me feels more real than anything I've been in years. Sue set down her coffee. She reached over and took his hand. Not romantically, not dramatically, just a quiet, steady grip. The way you hold someone's hand when you want them to know they're not alone. Trevor looked down at their hands. His were large and scarred and rough. Hers were smaller, graceful, calloused at the fingertips from years of signing and painting. He had held weapons with these hands. He had signed contracts that ruined men. He had carried his sister's coffin, but right now, holding Sue's hand on a rooftop in South Philly, with the city glittering below them and the November wind pushing through the silence between them, he felt something he hadn't felt since the fire escape. Peace. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Trevor Turner's life. He still ran his empire. He still took meetings in the back rooms of restaurants and the upper floors of the office buildings that didn't appear on any public directory. He still gave orders that moved money and shifted power and kept the machinery of his world turning. But in between, there was Sue. There were Tuesday afternoons at Whitmore, signing with the children, watching Rosie draw pictures of cats that looked more like potatoes, watching Marcus slowly come out of his shell and begin signing with confidence. There were Thursday evenings on the rooftop, drinking coffee and signing about things that mattered and things that didn't. There were Saturday mornings at the Italian market, where Trevor introduced Sue to the old vendors who had known him since he was a boy, and where she charmed every single one of them, despite not being able to hear their rapid-fire Philly accents. There were late nights when they sat on opposite ends of a video call, signing to each other from their apartments, and the silence between them was so full and so warm that it felt more intimate than any conversation Trevor had ever had. And slowly, gradually, like a house being rebuilt from the inside out, Trevor Turner began to change. He didn't become a different man. He didn't abandon his world. He didn't suddenly develop a conscience about things he had spent a decade refusing to feel guilty about. But he softened, in ways that were invisible to most people, but unmistakable to those who knew him well. He started funding the school, not publicly, not in his name, through a series of anonymous donations that tripled Whitmore's budget and allowed them to hire 3 new teachers and renovate the art studio that Sue had been trying to fix for 2 years. He handled the situation with the boys who had bullied Marcus, not with violence, not with threats. He found out who their parents were. He found out which school they attended. And he arranged, through channels that left no fingerprints, for that school to implement a comprehensive anti-bullying program with a specific focus on disability awareness. The boys never mocked anyone again. And he began signing every day. Not just with Sue. Not just with the children. Alone in his apartment, late at night, he would stand in front of the mirror and sign to his reflection. The same way he used to sign to Lily. Tell me about your day. What did you dream about? I miss you. One evening, standing in front of that mirror with the city dark and quiet outside his window, Trevor signed something he had never said before. Not to anyone. Not even to himself. I'm sorry I stopped talking to you. His reflection stared back at him, hands raised, eyes steady, and in the silence of his apartment, he felt something shift. Not forgiveness exactly. Forgiveness was too simple a word for something this heavy, but something like release. Like the first deep breath after years of holding everything in. It was the second week of December when everything came to a head. Vincent Mara showed up at Trevor's office unannounced, which was something Vincent had been told never to do. He walked in with Paulie and Sal behind him, and the 3 of them had the look of men who had something important to say and not enough courage to say it. Trevor looked up from his desk. He didn't speak. He just waited. Vincent cleared his throat. We need to talk about the deaf girl. Trevor's expression didn't change. People are talking, Vincent continued, shifting his weight. They're saying you've gone soft, that you're spending time at a school instead of handling business, that this woman has gotten inside your head. Silence. We set that whole thing up as a joke, Trev. It was supposed to be funny, one night, a laugh. But now you're visiting kids and bringing pastries and holding hands on rooftops, and people are starting to wonder if what? Trevor's voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that made the air in the room feel thinner. Vincent swallowed. If you're still the guy who can run this aim thing. Trevor stood up slowly. He placed both hands flat on his desk and leaned forward. Let me make sure I understand you correctly, he said, and his voice carried the weight of a man who had spent a decade learning exactly how much power could be packed into a whisper. You 3 arranged for me to sit across from a woman as a joke. You used her disability as a punchline. You thought it would be funny to humiliate me and degrade her in the same breath. And now you're standing in my office, telling me that the problem isn't what you did. The problem is that I didn't laugh. None of them spoke. Here's what's going to happen, Trevor continued. You're going to walk out of this room. You're going to go back to your jobs, and you're going to understand something that apparently needs to be said out loud. Since the 3 of you seem to have missed it, he paused. That woman you used as a prop, she teaches children, she gives them language, she gives them a way to be heard in a world that ignores them. She does more good in a single afternoon than the 3 of you have done in your entire lives combined. His voice dropped even lower. And the next time any of you speaks about her, or speaks to her, or so much as looks in her direction, you will answer to me, not as your boss, not as a business associate, as someone who will make you understand, in terms that require no translation, exactly how serious I am. Vincent, Polly, and Sal left the office without another word. Trevor sat back down. He pulled out his phone. He texted Sue. "Can I see you tonight?" Her reply came in seconds. "Rooftop?" He smiled. It was a small smile, barely visible, but it was real, always. That night, on the rooftop, with the December wind biting through their coats, and the city lights stretched out below them, like a carpet of fallen stars, Trevor signed something he had been carrying for weeks. "I need to tell you something." Sue watched his hands. "Before I met you, I hadn't signed in 4 years. Not once. I locked that part of myself away, because it hurt too much to use it. Every time I moved my hands, I saw her, my sister, Lily, and I couldn't bear it." He paused. His breath came out in a cloud of white in the cold air. "But that night at the restaurant, when you raised your hands and signed your name, something inside me moved, like a door opening in a house I thought I'd sealed shut forever. And I couldn't stop myself. My hands remembered before my mind gave permission. They answered you because they recognized you, not as a stranger, as someone who lives in the same world Lily lived in. A world that I used to belong to, a world I thought I'd lost." Sue's eyes were bright. The cold had turned her cheeks pink, and the street light from below caught the edges of her hair like a halo. Trevor continued. "You didn't just remind me how to sign, Sue. You reminded me that the best part of who I am, the part that sat on a fire escape with his little sister and talked about pigeons and clouds and the future, that part didn't die with Lily. It was just waiting. Waiting for someone who could hear it." He stopped. His hands fell to his sides. And Sue Hodges, who had spent her entire life being told what she couldn't hear, what she couldn't do, what she couldn't understand, looked at the most powerful and most feared man she had ever met and signed 3 words. "I hear you." Trevor closed his eyes. When he opened them, they were wet. Sue reached out and took both of his hands in hers, and she held them the way you hold something that has been broken and carefully, painstakingly put back together. Gently, firmly, with the understanding that it was both fragile and strong at the same time. They stood like that for a long time. 2 people on a rooftop in December, holding hands in the cold, saying nothing and everything in the silence between them. Below them, the city hummed. Cars moved through intersections. Sirens wailed in the UAI distance. People shouted and laughed and argued and lived their loud, chaotic lives without ever knowing that above them, on a rooftop in South Philly, a man who had forgotten how to feel was learning again. And a woman who had never heard a spoken word was teaching him that the most important conversations don't require sound at all. Christmas Eve at the Whitmore School was always a small affair. Paper snowflakes on the windows. A plastic tree with handmade ornaments. Cookies that the older students baked in the school kitchen, slightly burnt, but eaten with enormous pride. This year there was also a man in a dark coat, sitting in the back row of the assembly hall, watching a group of children perform a holiday song entirely in sign language. Trevor watched Rosie stand at the front of the group, signing with exaggerated enthusiasm, her tiny hands moving through the air like she was conducting an orchestra only she could see. He watched Marcus, standing near the back, signing more, quietly, but with a steadiness that hadn't been there 2 months ago. And he watched Sue, standing at the side of the stage, guiding the children with gentle cues, her face glowing with a pride so deep and so pure that it filled the room like warmth from a fire. When the performance ended, the children rushed off the stage to find their parents. Rosie ran straight to Trevor and climbed into his lap without asking permission. "Did you see me?" she signed. "I saw you," he signed back. "You were the best one." She beamed. Then she signed, "Are you going to marry Sue?" Trevor looked down at her. He looked at this 6-year-old girl with potato cats and missing teeth, and a heart bigger than the entire city of Philadelphia. And he signed. I think that's up to her. Rosie shook her head solemnly. No, it's up to you. You have to ask. Trevor laughed, a real laugh, a sound that several people in the room had never heard before and would not forget. Across the hall, Sue looked over. She saw Trevor laughing with Rosie in his lap, and she felt something settle inside her chest, like the last piece of a puzzle finding its place. She had spent her whole life learning to navigate a world that wasn't built for her. She had learned to read lips and read faces and read the subtle shifts in body language that told her what words could not. She had learned to be strong and independent and resilient because the alternative was to be swallowed by a silence that the rest of the world treated as a deficiency. But with Trevor, the silence wasn't something to overcome. It was the foundation. It was the thing that connected them. The language they shared. The world they both understood, and for the first time in Sue Hodges's life, she didn't feel like she was adapting to someone else's world. She felt like she had found someone who already lived in hers. After the assembly, after the children had gone home, and the teachers had cleaned up the paper plates and folded the tiny chairs, Sue and Trevor walked out of the school together into the Christmas Eve snow. The city was quiet in the way that cities only get on this one night of the year. The streets were empty. The snow fell in thick, lazy flakes that caught the light of the street lamps and turned the sidewalks into something from a painting. They walked together through Rittenhouse Square, past the fountain, past the bare trees, past the benches where pigeons would return in the spring. And then Trevor stopped. He turned to face her. The snow was falling on his shoulders, and in his hair, and on the collar of his coat. His breath was white in the cold air. His hands were trembling, and it had nothing to do with the temperature. He raised his hands. I spent 4 years believing that the best part of me died with my sister. That the person I was when I was with her, the person who signed and laughed and dreamed about the future, was gone forever. I built walls. I shut people out. I became someone that everyone feared and no one knew. Sue watched his hands. She didn't blink. And then you sat in that booth at Bellini's and signed your name, and my hands answered before I could stop them. Because the truth is, Sue, I didn't choose to sign that night. My heart did. It recognized you. It recognized someone who understands what it means to live in silence. And it decided, before I had any say in the matter, that it was done being quiet. The snow fell around them. You gave me back a language I thought I'd lost. You gave me back a world I thought I'd never see again. You gave me back myself. He paused. And I know who I am. I know the things I've done, and the world I live in. I know that none of this makes sense on paper. A man like me and a woman like you. But I have never in my life been more certain of anything than I am of this. His hands moved one final time. You are the most extraordinary person I have ever known. And I don't want to go back to the silence I was living in before you. Sue stood in the snow with tears streaming down her face, and she signed back with hands that were shaking and steady and sure all at once. Then don't. He stepped forward. She stepped forward, and in the middle of Rittenhouse Square, on Christmas Eve, with the snow falling and the city sleeping, and the silence wrapping around them like a blanket, Trevor Turner kissed Sue Hodges for the first time. It was soft. It was gentle. It was the kind of kiss that doesn't need a soundtrack or a script or a narrator to explain what it means. It meant everything, and somewhere, in a place beyond sound and silence, beyond memory and loss, a young woman with a notebook full of drawings and a heart full of art smiled. Because her brother had finally found someone who understood his silence, and that, in the end, was all she had ever wanted for him. Sometimes the most feared man in a city isn't looking for power or respect or control. Sometimes he's just looking for someone who speaks his language. And sometimes the cruelest joke becomes the most beautiful beginning, because love doesn't need words. It never did.